I wasn't looking for calendar anomalies when I started this investigation. I was researching historical timekeeping systems, examining how different cultures measured years and seasons, standard academic territory, the kind of thing you expect to find minor variations in, perhaps some cultural differences in naming conventions, but nothing that would challenge our fundamental understanding of how time itself has been structured. Then I found the gap knot, a small discrepancy, not a rounding error, an entire missing segment of time that once existed in multiple calendar systems across different continents, then vanished from official records with suspicious uniformity. And the deeper I looked, the more I realized this wasn't about calendar reform or scientific correction. This was about control, about synchronizing human consciousness to a specific rhythm, about erasing the memory of how time used to work. The number 13 appears in ancient timekeeping systems with remarkable consistency. 13 lunar months in a solar year, 13 moon cycles, 13 periods of approximately 28 days each, totaling 364 days, leaving one day outside the normal count. Cultures separated by oceans, by thousands of miles, by complete lack of contact, all independently arrived at 13 as the natural division of the annual cycle. The Egyptians tracked 13 months. The Druids organized their calendar around 13 lunar periods. The Mayans, the Aztecs, the ancient Chinese, all utilized systems that recognized 13 as fundamental to understanding celestial cycles. This wasn't primitive superstition. This was sophisticated astronomical observation, producing consistent results across unconnected civilizations. Then something changed. Between the 1500s and 1700s, calendar systems across the world underwent rapid transformation. Not gradual evolution, rapid, coordinated transformation. The 13-month system, which had persisted for millennia, was replaced with the 12-month Gregorian calendar we use today. The official explanation focuses on technical corrections, on aligning the calendar with the solar year, on fixing the drift that had accumulated under the Julian system. But that explanation doesn't address the fundamental question. Why 12? Why abandon a 13-month system that had worked for thousands of years across multiple independent cultures? The solar year is approximately 365.25 days. 13 months of 28 days equals 364 days. 12 months of varying lengths, 30 days, 31 days, 28 days, seems arbitrary by comparison. Unless the goal wasn't astronomical accuracy, unless the goal was something else entirely. Let me show you what happens when you map the old 13-month calendar against natural cycle. Each month aligns perfectly with lunar phases. Each month contains exactly 4 weeks. The mathematical elegance is undeniable. You can track time without complex calculations, without memorizing which months have 30 versus 31 days, without the absurdity of February, a month that makes no astronomical sense whatsoever. Now look at the 12-month system. January has 31 days. February has 28, sometimes 29. March has 31. April has 30. The pattern is chaotic. There is no natural rhythm. You have to memorize arbitrary rules. 30 days hath September, April, June, and November. Why? What astronomical principle dictates this arrangement? None. The 12-month calendar doesn't reflect natural cycles. It reflects something imposed. Here is where it gets uncomfortable. The shift from 13 to 12 months coincides precisely with the period of European colonial expansion and the consolidation of centralized timekeeping authority. Not coincidence, coordination. In 1582, Pope Gregory XIII introduced the Gregorian calendar, officially to correct drift in the Julian system. But the reform did more than adjust dates. It restructured how humans across the planet would conceptualize time itself, and it required force. Countries didn't adopt the Gregorian calendar through gentle persuasion. They adopted it through economic pressure, through political coercion, through the simple reality that international trade and diplomacy required synchronized timekeeping. Russia held out until 1918, Greece until 1923. But eventually, every nation submitted. The 12-month system became global standard. The 13-month alternative became forgotten history. The official records describe this as progress, as the triumph of scientific accuracy over primitive lunar observation. But the mathematics don't support that narrative. The 13-month system was more accurate for tracking lunar cycles, more elegant in its structure, more aligned with natural biological rhythms. Women's menstrual cycles average 28 days. Agricultural seasons follow patterns closer to 13 divisions than 12. The human body, the natural world, they operate on rhythms the old calendar reflected. So why change it? Why impose a less elegant system? Why force global adoption of a calendar that requires memorization of arbitrary rules rather than simple observation of natural cycles? Control standardization. The ability to coordinate economic activity, military operations, administrative functions across vast distances. A 13-month calendar, with its perfect alignment to lunar cycles, allowed local autonomy. Communities could track time by observing the moon. They didn't need central authority to tell them what day it was. But a 12-month calendar, with its irregular structure, requires official decree, requires printed calendars, requires dependence on centralized timekeeping institutions. Look at what happened in the transition. When countries adopted the Gregorian calendar, they didn't just change numbering systems. They lost days. In 1752, when Britain finally adopted the reform, the calendar jumped from the 2nd of September directly to the 14th of September. 11 days simply vanished. People went to sleep on the 2nd of September and woke up on the 14th of September by official decree. There were riots. Historical records document widespread public resistance. People understood perhaps more clearly than we do today that something was being taken from them, not just 11 days on a calendar. Time itself was being restructured. The rhythm of their lives was being altered by authority that claimed technical necessity, but offered no real explanation why the old system was inadequate. And here's the strangest part. Those 11 missing days weren't arbitrary. They represented the accumulated drift between the Julian calendar and the solar year. But that drift existed because the Julian calendar was already a compromise, already a departure from earlier 13-month systems. The missing days weren't correcting natural error. They were correcting errors introduced by previous calendar reforms. We were being synchronized to a system that had itself required synchronization. The deeper I looked, the more I found evidence of deliberate suppression of 13-month alternatives. In the 1920s and 1930s, there was a serious international movement to adopt the International Fixed Calendar, a 13-month system with 28 days per m-onth plus 1 intercalary day. The League of Nations considered it. Major corporations, including Kodak, actually implemented it internally. The system worked. It was more efficient, more logical, more aligned with natural cycles. Then it vanished. Not because of technical problems, not because of mathematical inadequacy, political resistance, religious objections. The vague sense that changing the calendar was too radical, too disruptive. But the real resistance came from institutions that benefited from the current system's complexity. Financial institutions whose interest calculations depended on irregular month lengths. Government bureaucracies whose power derived partly from managing temporal complexity. The infrastructure of control that had been built around 12 months. The 13-month calendar had one feature the 12-month system deliberately lacks: temporal symmetry. Every month identical, every week aligned, every year following the same pattern. This makes long-term planning easy, makes patterns visible, makes manipulation difficult, but it also makes certain types of financial engineering impossible, makes quarterly accounting awkward. Makes the fiscal tricks that modern economies depend on harder to execute. I started looking at historical texts, not the sanitized versions in modern textbooks, but original documents from the transition periods. The language is revealing. Calendar reform is always described in terms of necessity, of correction, of improvement, but the actual benefits are never clearly articulated. We needed to fix the drift. We needed to align with astronomical reality. We needed to standardize international communication. All technically true. None of it explaining why 13 months were replaced with 12. None of it addressing why a mathematically elegant system was abandoned for a structurally chaotic one. The official history presents calendar reform as inevitable progress. The evidence suggests something more deliberate, something more coordinated, something that required centuries of gradual implementation followed by aggressive standardization. And here is what troubles me most. We've forgotten that alternatives existed. Most people today have no idea that 13-month calendars were once standard across multiple civilizations. No idea that the current system is relatively recent in historical terms. No idea that the transition was resisted. That days were literally erased. That time itself was restructured by decree rather than discovered through observation. The calendar we use shapes how we think. 12 months means thinking in quarters, means financial years and fiscal planning, means Christmas shopping seasons and tax deadlines. The irregular month lengths mean constant calculation, constant reference to external authority about what day it is, what week we're in, how many days until the next month. We've internalized a system that requires us to depend on institutional timekeeping rather than natural observation. Imagine if we still used 13 months. Imagine if every month had exactly 28 days. Imagine if you could calculate dates in your head without memorizing special rules. Imagine if biological rhythms and calendar rhythms aligned. Imagine if time felt natural rather than imposed. That possibility existed. That system worked for millennia across independent cultures. Then it was erased. Not through natural evolution, through coordinated reform. Through the imposition of a system that benefits centralized control at the expense of individual autonomy. Through the creation of temporal complexity that requires experts, institutions, official calendars. Through the erasure of the memory that time used to work differently. The missing month isn't just historical curiosity, it is evidence. Evidence that our most basic framework for understanding reality, the calendar itself, is a construction, not a discovery, not a reflection of natural law. A deliberate choice made by authorities who had specific reasons for structuring time the way they did. Reasons that had nothing to do with astronomical accuracy and everything to do with power. Look at your calendar right now. Notice how February disrupts the pattern. Notice how you have to think about whether it is a 30 or 31-day month. Notice how leap years add complexity. Notice how none of this feels natural because it isn't. It is a system imposed, maintained, enforced. A system we've been taught is inevitable when it is actually contingent. When alternatives existed and were deliberately suppressed, the number 13 carries cultural weight. Unlucky. Ominous, avoided in building floor numbers in airline seating. We've been conditioned to see 13 as wrong, as unnatural. But for thousands of years, 13 was the number of months. 13 was the natural division of time. 13, aligned with cycles we could observe without technology, without expertise, without dependence on authority. And that might be precisely why it had to go. I keep finding references to 13-month systems in unexpected places, ancient texts that mention the 13 moons, indigenous calendars that preserve the old counting, folk traditions that remember when time worked differently. These references are dismissed as primitive, as superseded by modern understanding. But they all tell the same story. Time was restructured. The old ways were erased. The new system was imposed. And we forgot. Not gradually, not through natural cultural evolution. We forgot because we were made to forget. Because the new calendar came with new authority, new institutions, new ways of organizing society that made the old systems obsolete. Not because they didn't work, but because they didn't serve the purposes of those consolidating power. The 12-month calendar is a lie. Not in the sense that it fails to track solar years. It does that adequately, but in the sense that it pretends to be natural when it is artificial, pretends to be inevitable when it is imposed, pretends to be an improvement when it is primarily a mechanism of control. The missing 13th month isn't missing by accident. It is missing because someone decided that 12 months served their purposes better than 13. And that decision, made centuries ago, shapes every day of your life. Shapes how you plan, how you think, how you conceptualize time itself. We live in the remnants of a calendar war we didn't know was fought. A war over who controls time. A war that centralized authority won by erasing the memory that they were fighting it. Consider what happens when you try to research the transition itself. The historical record becomes strangely fragmentary. We have detailed documentation of the Gregorian reform's mathematical calculations. We have papal bulls and official decrees. But what we don't have are the counter-arguments, the voices of those who resisted, the scholars who defended the old systems, the communities that refused to adopt the new calendar. Those perspectives have been systematically excluded from official histories. When resistance is mentioned at all, it is portrayed as ignorant mobs rioting over superstition, as peasants who didn't understand the science, but read the contemporary accounts more carefully, and you find something else. You find sophisticated arguments about natural law, about the relationship between human time and celestial time, about the dangers of centralized temporal authority. These arguments lost, not because they were wrong, but because the institutions promoting calendar reform had more power, had printing presses to distribute their version of events, had the backing of colonial administrations that could enforce adoption, had the economic leverage to make the new calendar mandatory for anyone who wanted to participate in international trade. What is even more revealing is how the number 12 itself became sacred in the new system. 12 apostles, 12 tribes, 12 hours on a clock face. The symbolism was deliberate. Ancient numerology elevated 12 as the number of completeness, of divine order. But that symbolism served a purpose. It made the 12-month calendar feel inevitable, made questioning it seem almost heretical, made alternatives appear to violate some cosmic principle when in fact they violated only human decree. The evidence persists in the historical records, in the calendar systems that survived in isolated communities, in the mathematical elegance of 13-month alternatives that keep being proposed and keep being rejected. In the uncomfortable questions no one asks about why our current system is so unnecessarily complex. The missing month isn't lost. It is hidden, buried under centuries of official history that insists the 12-month calendar is natural, inevitable, correct. But once you see it, you can't unsee it. The gaps in the official story, the missing explanations, the coordinated global adoption of a system that makes no natural sense, the suppression of alternatives that worked better, the erasure of the memory that time itself was restructured by human decision rather than discovered through observation. We're living in temporal architecture designed by authorities who needed to control more than just land and resources. They needed to control time itself. And the missing 13th month is evidence of how completely they succeeded. Evidence hiding in plain sight. In every calendar on every wall, in every irregular month length, in every February that makes no sense. The lie isn't in the details. The lie is the system itself. And we've been taught to see it as truth.